Well, hello. Welcome back to Writing Off the Deep End.
I'm Mary Thaler.
And I'm Geoffrey Edwards. One of the earlier times we dealt with historical fiction, so looking at the past. And Mary got this great idea that we might want to switch that and say, look at the future.
So this came into my mind because when you tell people you write science fiction, I think that some people think that the main role of science fiction is to look into the future and kind of visualize what it's going to be like for us. And of course, that's only a small slice of all the wonderful things that science fiction can do. But it is a fascinating exercise to make that imaginative leap centuries or millennia ahead.
One of the writing workshops I did recently, it was pointed out to me that E.M. Forster wrote a book called Aspects of the Novel. So same writer who did
Passage to India and A Room with a View.
Wrote a book about writing the novel. And in it, he talks about the idea of a fantasy voice and a prophetic voice as being distinct from other voices in fiction. And he gave us an examples of a prophetic voice, Moby Dick, so Melville's story about the whale, and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which he also gave this prophetic flavor to it. It's not something we would normally think about as being prophetic, but what he meant was a kind of myth, looking beyond the immediate appearances of things and looking at a broader landscape. And you get that in Wuthering Heights. So there is a relationship between the two. But one might also apply the idea to a book, say, like Herbert's Dune, which, of course, has a explicitly prophetic component.
It sounds like he's saying it has to do with the scale of time that you encompass imaginatively in.
Yes, although Moby Dick certainly has some scale, but it's partly about the sort of animalistic prophecy of this whale who's much bigger than a whale in a way, right? So that's...
I would also make a distinction between what I would call predictive and prophetic. And they're used interchangeably. You know, in a newspaper story, people might say that something is prophetic because it seemed to predict something about the future. There's a interesting Old Testament scholar named Walter Brueggemann who said that the three main functions of a prophet are grief, anger, and hope. So a prophet tells you, well, anger, I think anger comes first. He tells you what's wrong. They tell you what's wrong in the world, what you can see going wrong with the environment, with people's relationships to each other in a sort of whole societal sense. And then the prophet grieves for what is wrong and what is being lost. And then the prophet gives you hope for what is to come. So in a Christian context, the prophet will say, well, the people have turned away from God, that our enemies have invaded us, but someday God will bring us home and everything will be wonderful again. And that is something that I think about in the context of my writing, more than I think about trying to accurately say what technologies the future will bring. I mean, that's fun to play with. But when I try to be prophetic in my writing, I try to, it's those three functions that I think about. I think about living in a world where things are going wrong and expressing anger and grief about it, but also giving the readers hope, if hope is appropriate, to that context.
Yeah.
So.
Forster also talks about the idea of prophetic being involving song, as opposed to narrative fiction, that it's about making a song or sounding like a song-like in the way one talks about things, which is also a very interesting idea.
It's lovely to think about the intersections of genre with this prophetic voice.
Right.
And that it has an ability to move between genres I think.
Yeah, so it certainly rang a bell for me in my work. So, my science fiction is, I guess, I wouldn't have called it prophetic, but I think it sits in that register, right? It's dealing with not so much the future as a possible future, because I don't think it's necessarily a possible future,
Yeah.
but as a carrier for information or ideas about the larger scale of human development, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and it has a song-like element to it. In fact, I use poetry quite a lot in my writing
Mm-hmm.
to bring that out. So,
I think, a few episodes ago we were talking about writing about history, and we talked a little bit about, I think, just different ways of approaching that, of things happen and as events, but also giving meaning, and the process of fictionalizing as giving meaning to events. And I think that this prophetic voice we're talking about is going towards that, towards giving meaning to what's happening now as we go forward into the future.
so can you tell me something about how you might use that in your writing? Give an example.
I have sometimes written fiction that tries to look at situations like the housing shortage in the Canadian North. To go to something very specific, all the way to stories about how we relate to each other intergenerationally as children and elders and adults, or of taking any aspect of our society and turning it into a story is, I think, can be thought of as a prophetic act.
Good answer.
Thanks. I feel like I should make you give an example of prophetic writing that you've done.
So I have this book that I wrote, a manuscript that I'm still working on about the future of religion. So it has perhaps a prophetic element in it. And it caused me to do a lot of reading in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism,
Mm-hmm.
Islam, all these different, I had a certain grounding in Christianity, but I didn't have a lot of grounding in other religions. And so I spent, almost a year doing reading through various different religions in order to, and visited different locations. So I went to Thailand, and I went to Bali, and I went to Australia, and I got to see some of these different religious cultures in operation as a tourist, but as a, let's say, an alert tourist in terms of these kinds of things. And then I wrote a science fiction book about that, about the experience of somebody who's learning about these different religions and then tries to link them together into a common or a larger view. So, it has that focus on larger than an individual, but it was about an individual, so.
And it is literally set in the future, right? Your book.
There's in the future, although it's in 1,000 years before my other books in the future. So
okay, it's our future, it's someone else's past. Okay, and that moving it towards the future probably gives you this long view, just to start with, a perspective, a posture of time.
Yeah, I suppose situating it in a different time allowed me to. It's a little bit why I do the science fiction the way I do it. It allows me to drop away certain preoccupations that we have in the present. For instance, in my future, nobody has to worry about surviving because there are all these nano machines in our bodies that take care of our basic needs, and we don't have to worry so much about that as we do today. And so it strips away the survival issues and leaves behind the growth, personal growth, anxiety, all the other issues. They are still there, but they can be dealt with in a different way than in the sort of current way. And so I was able to deal with religion again in the context where things were changing, but not necessarily the way they are today. So a different kind of context.
Do you think it is often the case, or perhaps even necessarily the case, that prophetic writing contains a call to action?
I think it may evoke some kind of action. I'm sure it is exactly a call, but I think that there's it's a kind of invocation in a way. It's a kind of opening to something happening, not necessarily an action per se, but perhaps a different way of understanding the world. Maybe that's what's going on in terms of what you're trying to do.
Perhaps that it is intended to transform the reader in some way, even more than most writing is.
It works. It works the way it's supposed to. Yes.
Yeah. You can add that caveat to all my writing. If it works the way it's supposed to, you be moved and entertained and changed.
I was thinking I didn't want to say it because I wanted to hear what you came up with, which was actually kind of interesting. But I think, in a way, your treatment of the dogs in the Shell Midden, it has a kind of prophetic air to it. So it's history, but it's got a kind of broader frame around it.
Let me think about that for a moment. I certainly was, when I was writing my novel about the sled dogs, I was thinking about patterns that have repeated through history. So the novel addresses things like migrations throughout the Arctic archipelago, and not just migrations, but relocations, and sometimes forcible relocations. And those have been aspects of human and animal life up to our present day, and sometimes, and in the case of forcible relocations, obviously a terrible aspect. And so even though I'm not writing about things that have happened in the 20th and 21st century, I do feel like the events that I'm writing about participate in a look ahead to that future that is coming towards the inhabitants of the Arctic, and in that sense may be somewhat prophetic.
So say the prophets. That's it for prophetic fiction. Next time, we're going to be talking to somebody that Mary met.
We're going to be interviewing L.P. Kindred, who is an emerging author with some very interesting short fiction that has come out and will be coming out, exploring the intersections of Blackness and queerness and some really exciting stuff. So we're looking forward to that.
And if you like what you're seeing or listening to, don't forget to subscribe.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.